Believe it or not, getting into clam farming can be a pretty smart move for making money. Clams are not only a tasty treat, but every so often you might hit the jackpot with pearls that are worth a ton of money. Oddly enough, not many people are up for it, all because of one small catch. Better ask Steve. When you take a dip in warm tropical waters with crystal clear seas and sheltered lagoons, you'll come across Tridacnagigas. These creatures are the largest bivalves globally, living a long life and growing at a leisurely pace, giving them plenty of time to reach giant sizes. Tridacnagigas got their name for a good reason. They're huge. See? Imagine a person standing next to one, and you'll get the idea. Yeah, they are big.
Seeing it in action is even scarier because the clam is alive and moves. Some even claim it can take down humans, and even sharks. When you think about how fragile that scuba diver looks next to it, it's not really surprising.
As I said, they're found in the tropical waters of the Indo-Pacific region, such as Papua New Guinea, Indonesia, Malaysia, Palau, Northern Australia, and the Philippines. Also, Tridacnagigas can be found in American island territories in the Pacific, like Guam. And it's actually worth looking for, because the giant clam's abductor muscle is considered a delicacy, making it quite valuable. While it may not be the case everywhere, countries like Japan, France, Southeast Asia, and various Pacific islands appreciate the clam's unique flavor. Additionally, clam meat is a part of some Asian cuisines, and in China, clams are even considered an aphrodisiac. Meat aside, giant clams fetch a hefty price on the black market, serving as a high-end decorative item. They're incredibly expensive. They can be used to make sculptures like this, or jewelry. Young clam shells are sometimes casually worn as necklaces. In China, people commonly use shells instead of ivory. Imagine strolling into an illegal shop and boom, you spot these massive clamshells. It's like bread in a bakery, the one that costs thousands of dollars. The big issue here is that there's way more demand than there is supply. People are definitely taking steps to address the problem, but it's not about banning the whole giant clam catching business. After all, there's good money in it. One of the solutions is starting a giant clam farming project. It started in the Philippines in 1984 as a joint project of 8 Indo-Pacific countries. It's been 40 years since they began growing those clams, but even today, the ones they started breeding back then are nowhere near ready to be served on our plates. Why? Well, these clams grow exceptionally slowly. It takes an incredibly long time for them to reach the desired size. And even though the project set out to find ways to grow giant clams for eating, it seems like people never quite got there. Making these creatures grow faster just doesn't seem to be possible, but people haven't given up trying.
To kick off the breeding process, skilled divers gather eggs from clams when they're in their female stage. After that, they simply collect genetic material from the male clams, just like that, simply tossing it into a bag.
A single clam can release as many as 500 eggs into the ocean during one spawning event, so there's no room for complaints about the yield. By the way, up close, these eggs look like this. They look like eggs. After mixing all the genetic material, it's placed in containers filled with water and left there. Waiting becomes the number one pastime for Tridacnagigas farmers because this tiny thing has to turn into this. Until they're 2.5 years old, the clams are vulnerable to predators. They're quite tiny. This one, for example, is only 3 months old. But as it often happens in nature, growth speeds up when clams are most fragile. They add about 1 inch to their size each year and stay on farms for some time. Usually, people wait for clams to grow to about the size you see on the screen now. That is, the clams stay in ground nurseries for 3 to 5 months. A lot depends on the species, of course. The bottom isn't sandy, but instead it's teeming with hundreds of tiny baby clams. It's up to the humans to look out for them. Ever wonder about those strange buoys attached to divers' feet? Well, that's to make sure no one unintentionally hurt the delicate baby clams down there. If you think this is weird, remember just how much adult Tridacnagigas cost. Young clams are placed in trays, cages, enclosures, or a mix of these on a substrate. These spaces offer a cleaner environment, reduce the risk of predators, and make it easier for people to reach them.
People use these mesh cages to keep small clams safe from the many predators lurking around, such as stingrays, turtles, and other creatures. Check out how the farm looks underwater. It kind of brings to mind those iron grids above graves from the Victorian era, doesn't it? It's a bit eerie.
Once they've stayed in the nursery for about 12 to 18 months, Tridacna gigas hit the 0.8-inch mark and then make their way to a different part of the farm. It's kind of like they're moving to the elementary school. You already know that Steve's a pretty tall guy, but even compared to him, the clam seems downright enormous, and that's not even the limit. Out of the 13 different kinds of giant clams out there, Tridacna gigas take the crown as the biggest. They can tip the scales at a whopping 1,100 pounds and boast a shell stretching over 3 feet long. This clam is the second heaviest invertebrate on the planet, falling just behind the massive giant squid, a legendary sea beast that's been fueling sailors' spooky tales for centuries. On average, when Tridacna gigas hits its 100th year, it weighs in at more than 440 pounds and measures around 47 inches across.
Getting back to the farms. When the clams reach maturity, the farmers get to choose where to grow them next, in the ocean or special pools on land.
If they opt for land, they'll need specialized equipment to maintain clean and warm water conditions. Water tanks should look something like this. Here's a glimpse into the typical day of someone farming clams in the ocean. Doing work underwater involves using diving gear and having skilled personnel. Perhaps this would be cheaper. Take a look at these clams. They might look all grown up, but actually they're still babies. You remember how big the adults can be, right? Believe it or not, by the time they hit 3 or 4 years old, their shells can stretch to about 10 to 12 inches. It's only at the ripe old age of 5 that they're ready to reproduce. But some of these little guys are slow bloomers, only hitting adulthood around 9 or 10. If they had the choice, they'd probably hang out with their parents a bit longer.
This clam here's just 6 to 7 years old. It might seem small, but the person holding it's starting to feel the effort it takes to lift this baby.
Many people think it's best to wait until giant clams are at least 10 years old and have grown to a length of about 22 inches before putting them up for sale. This is considered the optimal age for adulthood in these clams. For optimal clam harvesting, aim for a size range of 18 to 26 inches when the clams look like that. In the second case, be prepared to wait not 10, but 15 years. At the age of 20, this clam can reach lengths of 27 to 31 inches. And yes, you can harvest clams when they get even larger. For example, 47 inches, you'll get a lot more money for it. But let's be real. In this case, you'll have to wait at least 50 years. And this is clearly not a long-term investment that anyone can appreciate. Even waiting 15 years for a profit feels too long.
Picture a scenario where chicken farmers had to wait a whopping 10 to 15 years before their birds were ready for someone's dinner table, or even 5 years just for a single egg to be laid. No wonder shellfish farms are in decline.
Here's a simple but excellent illustration. Mass production of giant clams began in the 1980s in Palau. There's even archival footage from that time, and we can take a look at those farms. Initially, everything seemed fine, but over the next few decades, clam production took a nosedive. Now the clam industry is struggling, with only a handful of large clam farms worldwide. These farms, mostly in the Pacific Ocean, don't produce much and only cater to local needs, and boy do they move slowly. Remember, we're talking about a span of 10 to 15 years here. Even during those 10 to 15 years, there are ongoing expenses. Shellfish farming comes with various costs, even if you opt for growing them directly in the ocean instead of using nurseries. In any case, you'll need a place to rent, which comes with its costs. Then there are the people you hire, and the more skilled they are, the more they'll expect to be paid. All of these expenses need to be sustained for years without any profit before you can hope to sell something in the future. That doesn't sound like a very good business plan at all. For example, the Ocean Clam Nursery at the Marine Laboratory near Bolinao is home to 30,000 giant clams and covers an area of 14 acres, roughly the size of 7 soccer pitches. It looks like this. You dive, and everywhere you look, there are clams. So how can anyone manage such a massive operation? Turns out it all comes down to priorities. This nursery isn't raising clams for profit. It's all about maintaining and boosting the clam population to prevent extinction. The government foots the bill for this initiative, not everyday folks dipping into their wallets. After all, the government has deeper pockets. Lately, clam prices at the market have skyrocketed, and I mean a whopping 40 times increase. This means fishermen are raking in a whole lot more money. A single clamshell, once valued at around $300, is now commanding a hefty $12,000. It's like stumbling upon a gold mine, only with clams. Call it the clam rush. Steve and I stumbled upon a massive clamshell for sale priced at $6,000. To fetch such a sum, you certainly need shells of considerable size. This particular half shell, which cost $6,000, measured nearly 35 inches. In Taiwan and Japan, 2 pounds of dried adductor mussel used to cost $100 back in 1989. However, due to export bans in many countries, we couldn't find the current price. Given its illicit nature, it's likely that the price has grown a lot. Another challenge in mass-producing clams is their reproduction process. Unlike many other creatures, clams make things easy because they can generate genetic material from both females and males since they're naturally hermaphrodites. So in theory, it shouldn't be too complicated. But it's not that simple. When it comes to shellfish, it's best if they don't have offspring more than twice a year. You can force it, but it's not great for their health. Given the time it takes for clams to mature, messing with their well-being is like shooting yourself in the leg. It hurts like hell, makes no sense, and has a bunch of horrible consequences. To harvest a bunch of young clams, you want big, fully grown, and healthy clams that have been around for more than a few decades. But finding those is almost impossible. Existing farms today are quite rare, and their owners are unwilling to part with such valuable assets. This makes setting up new farms a daunting task, as finding a suitable mature individual to produce offspring is almost like searching for a needle in a haystack. I brought up clam health because not many people really know about clam diseases, let alone how to deal with them. So if one clam gets sick on a farm, it can quickly turn into a big problem for all clams. You realize what it means. One clam catches a cold and suddenly you're at risk of losing the whole bunch. That means all the hard work put in for years goes down the drain. No results, just wasted money, time, and a whole lot of stress. I have to say that the farms actually came about because of overfishing. Back in the day, no one was keeping tabs on the situation, and the giant clam population ended up on the brink of extinction. In 1976, they only caught 243 tons, but by 1980, that number skyrocketed to a whopping 11,930 tons. That's a lot, especially since people always target adults and larger individuals because they have the most meat and the biggest shell. But if all the adults are harvested, who's left to procreate? That's why they put a legal ban on harvesting giant clams, especially in places like the Philippines and other Southeast Asian countries. With large populations relying heavily on ocean protein, clams are in real trouble. First, clams aren't exactly speedy creatures, so they can't really escape from danger. Second, despite the bans, fishing still goes on in these regions because people simply need food to survive. A reef assessment done in the 1970s showed that giant clams in the Philippines were close to extinction due to poaching, overfishing, and habitat destruction. And that was back in the 70s. Things took a turn for the worse in the 80s, as evidenced by the escalating catch rates. People are actively depleting the population of poor clams, and it's not surprising given their high cost. In the Philippines, marine biologists have been trying to fix the issue by scattering young clams on the reefs for 30 years. However, if fishing is allowed again, all their efforts might go down the drain. The clams will likely disappear again, and this time there might be no way to bring them back. Remember when I brought up clamshells as an alternative to ivory? Well, ivory's still making waves in the market despite bans, but that's not the point. Let's rewind to the 1980s in Palau, where the police caught an illegal Taiwanese fishing boat carrying a staggering 7,500 pounds of pure clam adductor mussel. While the officers were busy offloading the meat, the poachers made an unsuccessful attempt to sway them with bribes. It was too late for the clams, though. Fast forward 40 years and not much has changed. Now, giant clam shells are now as pricey as their meat, and the police are going after those dealing in shells. It certainly looks impressive, and it's not some pearls. It's very difficult to hide something this huge.
These mountains are nothing but seized clams. They are literally as tall as a man, or even taller.
Just recently, there were two noteworthy incidents. In March 2021, Philippine officials seized illegally harvested clam shells valued at $3.3 million, a staggering 80 tons of shells. The Coast Guard spokesman estimated that it likely took locals 6 months to a year to amass such a massive pile. And just a month later, in April, there was another case in the Philippines. This time, it was over 200 tons of fossilized shells valued at nearly $25 million. What can I say? Seems like it's been a busy spring for the authorities. Beyond the tasty meat and sturdy shells of giant clams, there's another reason people love them. Open one up and you could hit the jackpot. Take a look at this pearl. It weighs a whopping 75 pounds and is valued at around $100 million. It's not your typical shiny jewelry pearl. It's huge, uneven, and kind of reminds me of a whale's vomit. Surprisingly, this stuff is pretty pricey too. And guess what? It holds the world record for the largest pearl.
It kind of looks like a huge tooth to me. This pearl, was hidden away from the world for a whole decade. The fisherman simply kept it at home, thinking of it as a good luck charm. If he'd stashed it under his pillow, the tooth fairy might have taken it.
Before the current record, there was a 14-pound pearl that set the bar. It had a price tag of $35 million and came from a similarly massive clam. Let's face it, pearls aren't exactly popping up all the time from shellfish. Oysters are the main pearl makers, but even among them, pearls are like a rare find, happening less than once in every 10,000 cases. To create a pearl, something like a tiny grain of sand, it needs to find its way into the shell. When this intrusion happens, a natural defense mechanism kicks in, coating the object with a beautiful layer of nacre.
What could possibly have gotten into that clam? A scooter?
Remember how I brought up the whole giant clams possibly munching on people thing? Well, it turns out those clams are just misunderstood. It happens a lot with larger species. We tend to jump to the conclusion that they're dangerous, and it's hard to blame humans.
Of course bad thoughts come to mind when you see this thing. It just has to eat everyone who comes near it.
Even in places where giant clams are abundant, folklore tends to portray them as aggressive beings. This could be because some parts of the clam look like they've grown teeth, suggesting they might snatch onto someone. In one Polynesian story, a clam bit off a monkey's paw, and in a Maori tale, a clam went after a canoe. I'm not sure how a clam can pull that off while just chilling at the bottom, but that's fairy tales for you. Stories from the South Pacific often mention tales of clams that sneak up on swimmers to either trap them or gulp them down whole. According to Wilburn Cobb's story about discovering the Pearl of Lao Tzu, a diver drowned after getting caught by a clam that wouldn't let go of his arm. So powerful are they that large sharks and rays that have accidentally crossed them have been seized and held, naturalist writer Charles Frederick Holder warned in his 1885 book, Elements of Zoology. Just because it happened a while back doesn't mean people were clueless about clams. They invented the Kraken after all. Even in the 1920s, Popular Mechanics magazine wrote that divers who accidentally step into the open lips of the monsters are not infrequently held with such force that they cannot release themselves and are drowned. We're talking about giant clams again. What's intriguing is that none of these stories have any proof at all. There's zero solid evidence that a huge clam could harm anyone, not even a regular stingray, not even a fish. And yet, the U.S. Navy has taken this and other reports of man-eater clams seriously, issuing a guide for divers on how to avoid being eaten. The man-eater clam rumor was so persistent that scuba diving manuals for years had tips on getting out of a giant clam's hole. These suggestions were pretty practical. Use a knife to slide between the valves and slice the clam's adductor muscle. Even though we haven't come across any pictures of that manual, I believe it might have looked something like this. Well, none of this really matches reality, you know. First, clams aren't into meat. Nope, fish isn't on their menu either. And second, sure, those valves can close, but it's slow, so much so that you'd have to leave your foot or hand in there for hours to get stuck.
Plus, clams usually just shut tight when there's trouble, and trying to make them open is impossible. It's not like you can even wedge your hand in there if you're determined to get stuck. No way.
Still, giant clams could be a lucrative business, so why bother raising them when you can simply harvest them directly from the ocean? First, it's against the law. And second, even seemingly harmless actions like taking a clam can harm the local environment. Clams, being stationary creatures, become a natural part of the reef after decades of growth. You can tell this by how well the clam fits in with its surroundings. People often come and snatch clams from their homes, but they aren't delicate about it. They end up wrecking the reef because they're basically ripping a piece of it off. The result is, well, see for yourself. 40 square miles of coral reefs, some of the most biodiverse on Earth, have been destroyed by the poaching and harvesting of giant clams in the South China Sea. These were places that were filled with life, but now they're gray and dead. And getting the reefs back to the way they were is incredibly difficult. Instead of clams, all that's left are these big tears. Carving up the reef just makes it impossible for anything to live there. The scars left on the reefs are so massive that they're visible even from space. Because these reefs are often linked, harm in one spot can affect others nearby, like a domino effect. Just a small nudge and the entire system crumbles. It's not just about harming the reef. Giant clams play a cool role by cleaning up the water. How? Simple. They filter water as they eat. Like I said, they have no interest in fish, just plankton and algae. Giant clams are like the backbone of a coral reef, providing shelter for various sea creatures like seaweed, sea sponges, snails, and young fish. Can $12,000 worth of clams really be worth wiping out a whole reef and disrupting the entire ecosystem? I don't think so. That doesn't stop the poachers, though. A couple of years ago, their actions were even caught on camera and shown to the whole world. But it didn't help. Poachers, as before, take their boats right up to the reef to break it with the propellers.
You know what that looks like? Boats are chained to the reef and then the engines are revved up until there's enough power to break nature's careful handiwork.
Calling this barbaric is an understatement. It brings about widespread and terrifying destruction. When propellers aren't enough, poachers use something like vacuum cleaners to suck up shellfish and everything in their vicinity. This not only takes a toll on the reef, but also creates sediment clouds that settle on coral and other marine life, cutting off their sunlight supply. No sun means no life. Ecosystems are being wiped out by poachers who don't seem to care about the consequences. According to the media, this is a constant problem, even though authorities are doing their best to stop the destruction. See you later.